Okay, now I want to talk about spaces. There are three spaces in Maya: world space, object space, and parent space. Which space you use will determine how the move tool or the rotate tool displays its axes. The axes are the different coloured arrows on the move tool or the coloured circular spheres on the rotation tool. World space uses the coordinates of the entire scene or the world. So up is always up, left and right are always left and right, backwards and forwards are always backwards and forwards. If that doesn't make sense yet, it soon will do. Object space will use the coordinates of the object that you have selected. So the axes will align itself with the actual object. So say it was this mouse. If I was aligned in object space, the axes would align with the orientation of the object. Parent space, often referred to as local space, will use the coordinates of the item above it in the hierarchy. Just remember that parent space uses the space of the object's parent.
Okay, so to better understand spaces, let's take a look at these rectangular cuboids. Well, let's start with translation spaces. So to change the space a control or an object is using, you select it, then you hold down the W key and left click in the perspective viewport. When you do this, this menu will appear. Currently I can see that object is checked. So let's change that to world. If we look at the axes now, when we select the object with the move tool, as we have done, you can see that the axes match those of the world. You can check this by looking in the lower left corner of the viewport, which shows the world space axis. If I move the viewport around like this, you'll see that both axes match. The Z, the blue line, is pointing in the same direction as is the X and the Y. So now let's switch to object space. Here we can see that the axes are aligned with the orientation of the object. If I rotate the object around and switch back to the move tool, you'll see that they continue to be aligned with it. So the Y is always pointing up out of this polygon at the top here. Let's compare that with world by just switching back, and we'll see no matter how I rotate this, the axes are always aligned with the world. Like so. Lastly, let's switch to parent space. It's hidden away for some reason, but if we just go through this axes menu, you'll find parent. We'll switch to that. So parent space uses the orientation of the item's parent. In this case, I've created a small hierarchy, so the cuboid at the bottom here is the child of the one above. If I select this one, you'll see they're both highlighted, and if I just move this around, you'll see the child follows. So we know that they are linked in a hierarchy. So if I now click on the child, you'll see the axes point in this orientation. They essentially have the same orientation as the parent's object orientation. The parent is using world orientation because it's the top of the hierarchy. But if I switch to object, you'll see that our orientation, the Y, is pointing up to this direction. If I just switch back to parent, there we go, it's pointing the same orientation. So it's actually using the axes of the parent.
So why am I telling you all of this? I'm telling you all of this because the space you choose has a huge impact on how you read the graph editor. I wish someone had told me this when I was starting out. It would have made the graph editor much easier to understand. The one thing you have to remember when using your translation curves is that the graph editor will only ever show you parent space on those curves. This is really important when you come to jump into the graph editor and start pushing and pulling those curves around, because you will get your information about which curve to push and pull around from the axes that you view in the viewport. Simple, right?
So if I look in the viewport now and decide I want to adjust the position of the lower object more to the right, I can see that by looking at the axes, if I just select it, I want to adjust the translate X curve. So if I go into the graph and highlight the translate X and grab hold of the key and then pull it up and down, it works, it's going left and right, great. But now let's say I was in object space instead of parent. Suddenly my axes readout has changed, and it appears that I want to use, well, probably a combination of a few different curves, but let's say translate Z. So I go into the graph, I select translate Z, I find the key, and I adjust this. But it's moving in the wrong direction. Again, this is because the graph is only concerned with parent space. That's not to say that world and object spaces aren't useful, they are, but you need to understand that the graph editor will not help you out when using those spaces.
Now let's look at the orientation axes. Now the orientation axes only have two spaces. Those are object and gimbal. Object uses the rotation of the object itself. You can freely rotate it by clicking on any of the coloured line controls, or anywhere in the sphere itself you can move the control as you need. And gimbal uses a mathematical formula to calculate the orientation of the object. This means that when you try and manipulate the axes, you can only do it one axis at a time. So just like the translate tool, the graph editor is only concerned with one of these spaces, and in the case of rotations, that space is gimbal.
So let's see how that affects the cuboid. To change the setting, I'll select the cuboid, hold E, left click, and go to Object. Here we can see I'm able to freely rotate the object however I like. So let's just do that and set a few keys. So I'll set one, frame 1, let's go to frame 10, move it around, and then another at 20, just rotate it around. If we look in the graph, we can see that a bunch of curves have been created. So now let's pick one of these curves and try and adjust a specific rotation. So let's say we want to twist it along the length of the cuboid. So it looks like I need to pick the rotate Z curve. So let's do that. I'll just grab the rotate Z curve, grab the key, move it up and down, and oh, it's moving in the wrong direction. This is because the graph only shows us what is happening in gimbal mode. So let's switch to gimbal. Here we can see that the axes are not in their uniform position. They have moved around. This can lead to a condition known as gimbal lock, whereby two axes end up sitting in the same place, effectively removing one axis of the three, which means that it becomes impossible for the object to rotate cleanly in that direction. And if you try to do that, it will flip and spin around as it moves from one key position to the next. Well, that's a lesson for another time, but I'll just show you an example. So if I move this axis over here, you can see that now essentially we only have two axes. During animating, I recommend sticking with object mode and switching over to gimbal if you need to adjust a specific curve. Switching to gimbal is the easiest way to find out what curve you should adjust. Once you know what it is, just switch back to object.
Okay, so that was a lot to take in. Hopefully you've got a better idea of what the graph editor does, and it's not quite so scary to think about using it when we get into animation. If you need to recap, just rewind back through the video and have another look. But for now, just remember the two important things. When it comes to translation curves, the graph editor will show you parent space, and when we're looking at rotation curves, the graph is going to show us gimbal space. If you remember those two things, it'll make your life a lot easier. Okay, so finally after that, I think we're ready to move into blocking. So if you're ready, let's go and do that.